Buonasera, benvenuti alla Casa Italiana Zerilli-Marimò della New York University. We are delighted to be part of the Penn World Voices Festival with this conversation with Ron Kubati that is going to be held by my colleague Rebecca Falkoff. I consider this like a sort of ongoing series that this time is part of the Penn Festival, but that we have been pursuing here at the Casa and in the Department of Italian Studies for quite a while. And it's the exploration of writers for which Italian has become the language of expression. And we have here Amara Lacus, and we had a brilliant conversation with him last year, during which I had a chance to at least see Ron Kubati. But I'm thinking also of other writers that came, like Giunpalairi, that was here very recently, that has adopted Italian as her literary language. I find these writers, without taking anything away from Italian writers born in Italy that were born speaking Italian, much more interesting. The motivation that is behind their choice of adopting Italian as a literary language, it's normally fascinating and much more rich in terms of motivations and nuances than we can find in writers that happens to be Italian. And that's why I was very happy when Ron accepted our invitation to be here with Rebecca Falkoff. I believe that Rebecca is going to tell you something more about Ron in her presentation, and just something about Rebecca Falkoff. As I said, she's a professor here in the Department of Italian Studies. She concentrates in contemporary Italian literature. Recently, she has taken a very keen interest in Elena Ferrante. She has taught very successful courses. She led a conversation here during the Penn Festival with Elena Ferrante's translator, Ann Goldstein, and we were under the siege of about 200 women that could not get into the auditorium. So this is much more cozy, familiar environment that we have this year. And Rebecca's interest is on Italian literature, migration, the cultural politics of genre. She's been doing an incredible job since she arrived at NYU in really shifting the interest of many of our undergraduate and graduate students in the direction of her studies. They fell under her spell, and I understand why. And it's my great pleasure to welcome back to the stage of Casa Italiana Rebecca Falkoff and her guest, Ron Kubati. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefano, for that generous introduction. And thank you, Ron Kubati, for being here today. And Miram Rama, I'm going to practice my Albanian since we have a native speaker of Albanian here. Actually, two. Oh, wow, great. Maybe more. Okay. So, buonasera, Miram Rama. Good evening. It's also such a delight to participate in another Penn Literary Festival. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
So, Ron Kubati is somebody whose work I've admired for a long time. His first collection of poetry was published in 1992, and then he's been publishing novels in Italian. The first collection of poetry was published in Albanian. He's been publishing novels in Italian since 2002. Since 2000. And I had the pleasure of meeting him in 2009 at a conference at the University of Chicago, where he was completing a PhD in Italian studies. And that was his second PhD. He also holds a PhD from the Università degli Studi di Bari in modern and contemporary philosophy. And he's published 4 novels in Italian. His first, Vai non torna, was published in 2000 and was awarded the Premio Grotteri. It's the semi-autobiographical story of Elton, a student of philosophy in Puglia, who came over, as Ron did, in the very first wave, and we can talk about the use of the term wave to describe immigrations, but in the first Albanian emigration of 1991, in March of 1991, and it's about Elton, who's there studying philosophy as more Albanians come over, and what it's like being one of the earlier immigrants. His second novel, M, is also set in contemporary Italy, and it's about an unnamed narrator in an unnamed city who struggles to negotiate professional and personal relationships between cultures. And then his two more recent novels are historical novels. And so he's really moved away from the contemporary questions of immigration, although they're still very present in some ways. So his next novel is Il Boio del Mare, which was a prize winner at the Festa dell'Unità, and it tells of an unnamed child who witnesses his father's hanging, and then wanders sort of aimlessly amidst a wartime setting, and sort of gets caught up in a kind of, let's say, a kind of unintentioned heroism that's very moving. And finally, he's just published this novel, La Vita dell'Eroe, and he's also translated it into English, or he's also rewritten it in English.
Yes.
Yeah. And it is set during the Resistance, and it's about the life of a hero, and it's set in Albania. So there's also a move away from the contemporary explorations of immigration in Italy, and back to Albania in historical settings. So Kubati's work, or Ron's work, has been widely anthologized. He's also written numerous scholarly articles, and he's the subject of numerous scholarly articles. So it is my great pleasure to welcome him this evening.
Thank you for inviting me.
So maybe to go back to Stefano's introduction, we could talk a little bit about why you decided to write in Italian.
Well, it wasn't a decision. It was something very familiar, very spontaneous. I was writing in Albanian, and I was in Italy from a few years. I had published a volume of poetry in Albanian, then I was continuing to write poetry, and then someday I felt that the lines were coming, one in Albanian and one in Italian. So, this is because at some point my inner voice changed because spending your day fully in a new context, fully in Italian, working, friendship and everything else in Italian, at some point it dominates, and you start talking to everybody in that language, and that becomes the language of your thoughts. So it decided for me, and I started writing in Italian. I finished my first novel a couple of years before it was published in 1998, and at the time I was finishing my BA thesis in philosophy, so I was writing both of them, and it was a full immersion experience writing in Italian two things, and it just worked. I mean, it wasn't perfect from the very beginning. It needed some editing, of course, but it worked.
And now you continue to write in Italian, even though you've been living in the U.S. since 2008.
Well,
is there something in the Italian language?
Obviously, it's a wonderful language with a wonderful tradition. What's going on here is that I'm in U.S. since 2008, so only 8 years. English is starting to fight the other languages. Mm-hmm. So because obviously I'm surrounded with activities in English, and that's I feel it very natural. But I am spending my day in three languages because I talk to my family in Albanian and on Skype. They are not here. I use Italian because I teach Italian and I study Italian, and so Italian is still very, very strong. And English is the language of the present, and it is becoming stronger and stronger, but in a few years we'll see. For now, I find Italian as a language who offers me a wide possibility of expression.
Do you think that the novel changed considerably as you rewrote it in English, or did you try to rethink or what was that process like?
I tried to stay close to the novel. I tried to re-say the same things that I've said in the novel. Since this version is not published, it's just in my computer, I don't know how the final version will be, but for now it's very close to the original. So.
I hope we'll see the final version soon. I hope it'll be published soon.
I hope so.
So we were gonna hear an excerpt. Carlotta Branton of the Kairos Italy Theater will read an excerpt from La Vita dell'Eroe. But first, would you like to introduce it?
Okay, so this is my last novel. It was published a few days ago, basically, in Italy, still arriving in the libraries. I received it at the beginning of this week and I sent it to her, so it's like last moment thing. I started this novel before coming to US, and then I had to interrupt because my studies at the University of Chicago kept me very busy and they didn't leave me much time. But I finished it a couple of years ago, and then I had to wait to find the publisher. The novel covers 10 or 15 years from 1938, I would say, to the 50s, mostly in Albania, but in Italy also. They are the years of the Italian occupation of Albania. At the same time, they become the years of the Cold War. And it's the relation between the characters in the novel going through all these changes, and they are very quick changes, and this very intense period of change for the country, because from a traditional country it has to face or to be overwhelmed somehow by modernity, but by the harsh side of modernity, by the soldiers, and at the same time, though, the reaction embracing communism as anti-fascism, it was another modern response to what was going on. So the changes that happen in those years are very intense, and they go from a traditional multi-religious country to an atheist country, and when minorities are seeking emancipation, and all the relations through people are changing, and the center of power is changing, and at the same time the international relation between Albania and the East Camp and Italy are changing very often. And there are many interesting episodes within the novel. For example, the character starts as a member of, he comes from a wealthy family, but starts as a member of the resistance fighting Italian fascists. But then at some point after the arrival of the Nazis, there were in Albania 100,000 Italians, soldiers, that they were trapped in Albania. They didn't know where to go. And they were saved in many ways by the Albanians themselves. But a part of them decided to embrace the resistance, and they founded il Battaglione Gramsci. And so the character at some point is involved with Il Battaglione Gramsci. But after the end of the Second World War and the beginning of the Cold War, the character, the protagonist, becomes a member of the Albanian Secret Service. So the positions change once again. The communist country becomes an enemy from the other side, and so I don't want to spoil the plot. And so many other things happen. Going back to the part that she will read now is the moment when the protagonist is the head of unity of guerrilla, so of resistance, in Tirana. He is very young. He has a friend, a close friend, who has a younger sister. And this is this gives life to a very unusual triangle that is difficult to understand from here if you don't live in those years in those countries. So the responsibilities of a brother for a sister are very serious and tragically serious. So this triangle becomes dramatic, and she will read exactly the moment when somehow this line, the line of the friendship, is crossed, and the relation between the protagonist and the younger sister of his best friend becomes something more. And then the dramatic consequences of this event breathe in the novel, and they continue during the novel. But this is the moment when all this starts. Thank you.
La Resistenza aveva dato un'opportunità importante alle ragazze. Potevano agire concretamente, occupando il centro della scena. Anche se molto giovane, Ana aveva assunto compiti di coordinamento per conto dell'unità di guerriglia del fratello e si era spesa moltissimo nel raccogliere aiuti materiali per la Resistenza. Sentiva allora allentarsi i fili invisibili che le legavano le mani e rendevano la sua passione impossibile. Intuiva che la guerra fosse questo: caos, anarchia, dramma, dolore, ma anche dal punto di vista delle passioni, a tratti libertà. La gente moriva, c'era il coprifuoco, si sparava, nelle case irrompevano soldati, alcuni diventavano eroi, altri tradivano. Gli adolescenti erano meno adolescenti e le donne erano un po' uomini. Non che la guerra ad Ana piacesse. Ad Ana piaceva Sami e Sami era un eroe. La guerra era pathos e il pathos incendiava Ana. I generali, le uniformi, i discorsi, le macchine, le bombe, la resistenza finivano dritto nei suoi ritmi biologici, circolavano sotto la pelle giovane, le arrossivano le guance, la facevano arrabbiare, odiare, sognare e si concentravano in un esplosivo desiderio unico, tanto riproduttivo quanto idealista. Nella sua testa l'adorazione per Demi, l'antifascismo e l'amore per Sami erano una cosa sola. E proprio qui gli eventi la colpirono. L'unità del fratello prese di mira una caserma di fascisti. Avevano preparato tutto con cura. Si erano incontrati più volte a casa di Demi per mettere a punto il piano e Ana era stata felice di interromperli, portando ora delle bibite, ora qualche frutto raccolto in giardino. Li lasciava sul tavolo e poi si metteva tra Demi e Sami. Appoggiava una mano sulla spalla del fratello e l'altra la faceva delicatamente scendere di tanto in tanto su quella di Sami. Lui, seduto, la guardava di sottecchi, sforzandosi di non mangiarsela con gli occhi. Lei se ne accorgeva e ogni tanto si piegava per parlargli all'orecchio. Strano il sapore sano di Ana, la sua salute candida delle sue guance. I capelli lisci e soffici scivolavano in un sussurro imposto dal chiasso della stanza. Sami le sparava a raffica le domande più ovvie, costringendola a dargli le risposte più semplici, in una conversazione la cui anima sottile risiedeva nella continua vicinanza di labbra, orecchie, capelli, guance e nei piccoli tocchi delicati che sapevano di baci ma baci non sembravano. Poi, per forza di cose, Sami doveva occuparsi d'altro e si riscuoteva pieno di energia, come ricordandosi all'improvviso che in gioco c'era la vita sua e dei suoi amici. Il giorno dell'azione Ana si svegliò piangendo. Un brutto presentimento le stringeva il petto. Non disse niente, perché niente si poteva dire. Indossò la maglietta verde che metteva quando voleva scacciare i guai. I ragazzi erano appostati su un'altura alle spalle della caserma fascista. Sami osservava concentrato la scena, Demi fumava silenzioso, gli altri compagni aspettavano. A destra di Demi, Jevdet era curvo sulle ginocchia, come un atleta sulla linea di partenza. Bekir non parlava.
Grazie.
I love that passage. It's so, I mean, you spoke a lot about the very concrete historical situation, but there we're seeing the personal and how it transposes into a personal narrative. But it also reminds me in a way of futurists and the futurist idea that guerra è l'unica igiene del mondo, or that there's something particular, there's a kind of vitality and erotic charge to war, or that it's, or I mean, on the one hand, there's that sense that it's this moment of great freedoms and erotic power, and then also a time when adolescents are becoming less adolescent and women are becoming more men. So it's also disruptive of the kinds of social categories that might be in play. Is that how, or how were you imagining war as a kind of?
Well, I didn't want to romanticize it. I grew up with the epic of the war. You know, communism came into power thanks to the resistance, and they they built an important epic about the war. So I had those ideas in my mind, but I'm writing it from here and from after many years. I wanted to show the war from different perspectives, and one of the perspectives is the perspectives of a young woman that is trapped somehow in traditional codes, and she understands immediately that the emergency that the country and her city and friends and everybody else is going through creates a strange freedom. Creates a strange freedom where her own desires could find moment, just for a moment, maybe just for a while, could find a possible satisfaction. So she understands the tragic and the way the novel continues. I mean, she goes through the whole process, but at that point she understands that it is very dramatic, but she cannot help it to feel it even, you know, to put on the same page idealism and her desires. So this is her perspective in that moment. Again, mm-hmm. I'm not romanticizing the war.
Right. Okay. What about the hero? I mean, I was interested in this novel. The figure of the hero is somebody willing to perhaps die for their country, mm-hmm. And then the figure you explore in your first two novels of somebody who is willing to die to escape his country, and how the heroism of the migrant interacts with the heroism of the war, and and also maybe part of that question is why have you turned to historical fictions?
Well, so many things to say altogether. Okay, so I will start from the last. I've returned to this one because I understood with my first novel that I had met, if it is possible to say this way, suddenly the history or a bigger force, something wider that was a force that you cannot resist against. And I want to understand better my life by understanding the history that was behind it. So I understood that many historical turns had decided my life. Like, really, many times joking with my friends, I tell them I never met a therapist, but if I will meet ever a therapist, I would want him or her to be an historian. So, because it's impossible to understand my life differently. And this is the reason why I need to understand how things happen and why things happen. So the relation of the individual with the history is at the center of my work, of many of my novels, at least of my last novels. And with this framework, we have to understand the change of the concept of the hero, because it's not a fixed concept. It depends from the context and from the historical moment. So if in Byron Torna there was in the final chapters of the novel there were the students of the University of Tirana that they were at the same time doing something with contradictions at the very, if you don't stop thinking. They were trying in the morning to find a way to go, to leave the country, so via the sea, and in the afternoon going back in the square and fight against the regime. Well, there was a double block.
Right.
The regime and the border.
Right.
And fighting the regime and fighting the border, it was the same thing. And the border was imposed by the regime because it was part of its own power. It was very important. So they risked their lives in both ways, fighting at the square and trying to leave. It
Right.
was exactly the same thing. And why it was the same? What were they looking for? They were looking for to change deeply their lives and the lives of the collectivity. Changing their lives, search for the otherwise, as I used to tell it when writing about Byron Torna, would come from two different sources, or from bringing down the regime or from leaving the country. And at some point, they succeed on leaving the country. And they succeed on both, because the regime goes down too. But talking in less abstract terms, what the people, or what we, because I was there, then what we as students wanted during those protests is bringing the country turning the country into a normal European country. So our slogan was, we want Albania as the rest of Europe. Okay. So by going to Europe, there wasn't any contradiction. So
Right.
This is what we wanted. This is what we are fighting for. So, I don't see a contradiction there. In the other context, there is a completely different situation. The country is occupied by first from the fascists and then from the Nazis. In order to pursue a normal life, you have to fight the fascists and Nazis. There is no even for a moment a question of what to do. That is the right thing to do. So there is the hero is an historical concept that must be put into a context. In one context means something, in another context means something else.
That,
yeah, this is how I see it.
No, thank you for that answer. That really, it's a really amazing point that that it's not that the hero is leaving his country, it's that the hero is fighting for what is right for his country by traversing the border that is not right in that context. I mean, yeah, that's I think that's really an interesting way of putting it.
And there are many other things to consider. After World War, Albania was still fighting to exist as a country, while today we are moving, we as many nations, and we as people, we are moving in a kind of post-national horizon, okay? So Europe is a new possible country, a new possible federation, where all the European states are trying, with many difficulties and contradictions, and again without idolizing, are trying to, and this is something that it's almost the first time ever, trying to go beyond the national organizations of the state. And this is, they're experimenting something new. And in this context, from this point of view, the individuals reflect the moment. So it's the context is absolutely important.
And I mean, I think that really drives home a point that we were discussing earlier about how, well, I mean, I asked you upstairs about how in your description of the departure from Albania and Vai non torna, it's figured as a kind of call that one can't resist, as something that that sort of sweeps you up in history. And it's really interesting to think about heroism as not opposing the direction of history, but sort of being fully within history, and therefore is not so much a question of I mean, of course, there are dangerous directions one could take that, but it seems like in some ways it really moves the individual away from the critical component of heroism, paradoxically. Does that seem fair?
Well, I mean, in that moment there was something very, very particular, because the country was isolated, and the event that started all this happened far from Albania, the fall of the Berlin Wall. But the mentality of the people changed deeply, and the running towards that ship was amazingly an individual decision. And what was interesting to see, that a whole country decided to do that. A huge collectivity at the same time took the same decision. So this is the force of history. This is the force of history. So the relation between the hero and the history is a difficult relation. I do think that there are moments when heroes are very much needed. I hope to live in context and in times when heroes are not needed. So when heroes are needed are tough times. So this is how I feel it.
I mean, I wonder if the changing way that wars are being fought, either as proxy wars, or they're being fought from the air, or there's a lot more aerial bombing and less fighting on the ground, and if that changes the nature of heroism.
Well, I mean, this is a relation of the human being and technology. Are we moving towards a post-human context? I mean, let's put it in the development of technology. We are reading in newspapers that in the next years many jobs will be lost, and technology will replace many of our jobs. What could be a hero today? Maybe a hacker?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I think so.
So today maybe the hero is less physical and more with more knowledge and more better skilled. So maybe a century ago the hero was again a physical one. Today the hero must be somebody with great knowledge and with great skills.
What about literary heroes? To change the subject a little, since we're at the Penn Literary Festival, but who are some of your literary heroes, and maybe also how do you see your work as fitting with the tradition of resistance, of Italian resistance writing, mostly from the post-war period? But
okay, so starting again from the second, and then I'll switch to the first. I'm starting with the second because I've always thought how interesting it is for a country to, at some point, to need to receive its history, in the sense that since Italy now is inhabited from many new citizens, in order to understand the history of this collectivity, you have to rebuild many other histories and to see things from a wider point of view. Going back to my formation, during my high school, so in the age when we start to read, we had a country who was very, there are many contradictions. So we had a strong censorship, but at the same time, a strong feeling of that culture is very important. So between, thanks to all these filters and these contradictions, I read I read obviously the Albanian writers, the most important of them, but I read the most important Russian writers. So then I read many of the so-called critical realism, and I loved, I don't know why, the writers of the Lost Generation. So it was a very varied formation. But then I arrived very young in Italy, and for my studies and for everything else, I recouped the knowledge of the Italian tradition. So I have read mostly all of the most important Italian writers, and I'm focused on contemporary studies, and I feel great interest. One of the main authors that I work on is Calvino. So, but there are other writers that sometimes, just by chance, going at the library and at the bookshop, and it is exposed there, and you read the first page, this is interesting. So this, a few years ago, I was reading Agatha Christie, the trilogy of the City of K, and I loved her, and it's like one of the best books that I've read. So it depends. I read continuously. Let's say that the need for for that kind of literature that I need in a moment changes always, and it's different. It's different from year to year. So I cannot ever say that this is my favorite writer. Going back to the resistance, I didn't use any canonic novel that talks about resistance. I had information about the resistance from people who had lived it. I heard many stories about it, So this is how I thought it, but again with a wider perspective of many years after, and trying to understand the history, trying to deal with history. So not just the resistance, not just romanticizing and saying how important it is, but seeing the contradictions and putting it in a wider historical frame.
I also wanted to ask you a little bit about, it seems as though in your more recent work, you use more Albanian words in the text, partly for the obvious reason that they're set in, a good part of them are set in Albania. But I also wondered about your imagined reader, and you do, you in the context it's clear what the Albanian words mean, but I wonder, whether you see yourself as also educating an Italian reader in a cultural tradition, or whether it's, or how that, why use Albanian words, and who is your reader?
Well, there are.
That sounds weirdly hostile, but I don't mean it that way.
Yeah, no.
I mean, I like seeing them.
I guess I'll have to answer this later too, because this is the topic of the closing panel.
Okay.
So,
okay.
And I'm now worried about consuming all my arguments.
Right.
I don't know
okay.
what to say later.
That's more inspiration, but okay.
I mean, it's the problem with the reader, the imaginary reader.
Right.
That's the issue here. Okay, so in this case, I felt that there were some relations that it was even the sound of what is written there could help to understand the affection, and most of the times it is about the sound. So it is used when the sister addresses her brother, and that's a very particular relation, and that is the topic of the novel somehow. And when they use scary terminology, sometimes religious ones, and they say it, we don't know what that means. They maybe are not Albanian at all, but the sound of it produces in us the real effect.
Right.
So, and so I thought, well, keeping that sound the way it is and not trying to translate it is the only way to do this.
Right.
So, but it could be like 1% of the novel. It's here and then. It's not like absolutely, but it's not a bilingual or anything like that.
Right. I think we have time for one or two questions from the audience, if you have any questions.
When you spoke of hackers and heroes, I immediately thought of Edward Snowden, who has unmasked the way totalitarianism uses technology as a weapon. That was just
I wasn't referring. Disclaimer: I wasn't referring to him. I was following the logic of living in a technological time. So this is a technological time. I'm not saying who is the hero and who is not the hero. I'm saying that in a technological time, a way to imagine the hero could be imagine him as a hacker. For example, let's even science fiction movies. Let's think of Matrix. The protagonist is a kind of a hacker. So it seems that today the hero could be a hacker. So I'm not saying about the character. I'm not talking about Snowden in this case because it's not my novels are not about him. So, but the concept of the hero changes according to the context, and our context is highly technological. So, this is it. Yes.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask a question. Going back to the earlier discussion about the Italian language and writing in the Italian language, I wonder if you have any opinions about dialects in Italy. I know Elena Ferrante was mentioned earlier, and in her novels, Neapolitan dialect comes up quite a bit, and it's used to make a point, if a character is speaking in the dialect, it means something different in terms of what they're saying, the context of what they're saying. And I was just wondering, when you went to Italy and you started writing it in Italian, did the issue of dialects come up at all for you? Like, did you hear different dialects? Or?
Oh, many. I mean, there is something very interesting about this. So I learned Italian at the university, so by studying philosophy, and so somehow I was lucky because by learning that language I could use it in other contexts. But there were migrants living in small cities, small towns, that they were not. They didn't have other contacts but the people that the other workers that were surrounding them, and so they learned a deep dialect of the context and not the Italian. And sometimes when they want to move from one place to the other, it's a problem because they know better dialect than Italian. So in Italy this can happen very often, and when you come from outside you see this. And you go from one small town to another one 5 kilometers from there, and they already talk another language. So, and the thing is that you develop, the ability to understand the roots of those words, and intuitively to understand what they are saying. So, but it is very.
But was your inclination to say these are very important dialects with a rich tradition, and they need to be valued and treasured and preserved or cultivated or promoted? Or did you have the feeling that, well, they're going to go away and that will be good?
I mean, nothing that disappears is good. Okay, it's sad, but at the same time, my experience tells me that I mean, I live in 3 languages, but it didn't happen from one day to the other. Moving from one place to the other and struggling with languages, I had to pay a high toll. If I could have used a universal language right from my childhood, so would have been very easy. I'm not saying that, I'm saying I wish I'd studied this language that I'm living since I was a child and studying them better. I started, but then I had to interrupt. But this is my point. So languages are difficult. They take time to be learned and to be mastered, okay? So it depends on what kind of world we are projecting to live. If we want to live everywhere in the world, we need a universal language that we can use for having a proper life, to be able to express ourselves properly, to write properly, to work, to have the chance to work, because without using properly the tool, the language, it's impossible to work. On the other hand, we can develop dialects in smaller context, but it's up to us to do that. We can inspire a culture that has this sensitivity, but again, it's important to know languages. As a migrant, I'm saying this, to know languages that can be used everywhere in the world. The language is a barrier. It's very difficult to master it. So, yes.
I think, yes.
I wanted to ask about the language. Like, was it one of the interlying reasons why Albanians chose Italy as that immigration country? Because I immigrated in Italy too, but I'm the generation that was practically up with Italian television. So at the age of 5, I could speak television because of watching all the cartoons, and the TV and the Italian TV and Italian language was so spread in Albania by the time, I'm talking about the end of 90s, that we all used to speak Italian, and we dreamed about immigrating in Italy. So that's why, I mean, most of my friends there, we went in Italy to study. Do you think that in the 90s, the fact that secretly the Albanians were watching TV with like the handmade antennas that I've read, made them choose Italy as the immigration country?
You mean in the 90s or the 80s?
Before the 90s.
Because in the 90s, I mean, I was already in Italy.
Yeah, I know, but before the 90s, my brother-in-law used to make antennas to watch the Italian soccer league.
Yes, we did that, but it was possible only during the summer because it requires warm weather. During the winter it was very difficult. So it was a little partial. So that would have helped a lot, but I mean, it helped me. But when I arrived to Italy, I had to do all the work. So I had to do it. But maybe people from that closer to the sea, like from Flora,
That's where I'm from. From Flora.
yeah, they are very close, Canale d'Otranto, so it's very close, and they are advantaged. But from Tirana, you need it from June to August, and not always. When it was raining, oh dear, it's raining, we cannot watch the movie. So it is like that. So you cannot count on that. But I mean, I had to do the whole work. So I think well, Italy and Albania are close, not only geographically, but the history has, for example, I started to read the first book that were not filtered from the censorship in Italian without knowing real Italian, because I wanted to read those books. So there was a dependence of the public library where they have left books in Italian that from the Second World War. And they were there, and censorship didn't care about them because they were forgotten there. So I started reading, for example, Dumas in Italian without understanding understanding only the 10% of the novel, but not much. But I'm saying that Italian culture was was present in Albanian culture. My first book that I ever read was Pinocchio.
Wow.
So I was 6. No, in Albanian, I was 6. So, yes. There are other questions.
I think we actually need to conclude, but let's all thank Ron Kubati and say Faleminderit Shumë. Thank you so much.